The summer I turned 17, I thought I had my family figured out. We were a neat, predictable equation. My dad, Robert, was a structural engineer, a man who believed the world could be solved with the correct application of logic and reinforced concrete. My mom, Susan, was a high school English teacher who found solace in the structured chaos of iambic pentameter. And then there was me, Liam, caught between the certainty of math and the ambiguity of literature, spending my vacation in the comfortable, air-conditioned bubble of our suburban Michigan home. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, was the one variable in our family equation that never quite balanced. His name was Ben. Where my mom was grounded, Ben was adrift. He'd been a touring musician in his 20s, a fact he'd mention with a wistful smile that never quite reached his eyes. Now, in his late 40s, he lived in a small, slightly dilapidated craftsman house a 30-minute drive from us, making a living, as far as I could tell, from sporadic freelance graphic design and what my dad called, with a hint of condescension, his mysterious little projects. I loved Uncle Ben. He was the one who gave me my first guitar lesson, who introduced me to bands with weird, wonderful names like the Velvet Underground and Pixies, and who talked to me like I was an adult, not just a kid. But I'd also absorbed, through the subtle osmosis of family dinners and offhand comments, that Ben was a cautionary tale. He was the what if, the talented, brilliant soul who never quite made it, who lived in a house cluttered with art and old amplifiers instead of in a tidy, mortgaged home like ours. That particular Tuesday was stifling. The air was thick and humid, and the sun beat down with a relentless, heavy intensity. My parents were at work, and the silence in our house had begun to feel oppressive. Boredom, that great motivator of teenage misadventures, had set in. I'd texted all my friends, but they were either on vacation or stuck in summer school. I'd scrolled through every streaming service until my thumb ached. I was adrift. Then I remembered Uncle Ben. He'd mentioned a week ago that he'd picked up a vintage Fender Stratocaster for a song and was planning to restore it. A real beauty, Liam, he'd said, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone. Needs some work on the pickups, but the neck is straight as an arrow. You should come by and see it sometime. Sometime became now. I didn't call or text. Spontaneity felt more authentic, more in line with the kind of person I imagined Ben to be. I told myself I was bringing him a peace offering, a 6-pack of the craft root beer he liked, sweating in a paper bag on the passenger seat as I drove my beat-up Honda Civic across town. His neighborhood was older, with towering oak trees whose branches formed a canopy over the streets, dappling the pavement with shifting patterns of light and shadow. His house, painted a faded forest green with peeling white trim, always looked like it was sleeping. I pulled into the cracked concrete driveway, noticing his old, primer gray pickup truck was gone. Weird, I thought, maybe he's out getting parts for the guitar. I decided to wait. Ben was notoriously bad with locks. There was a spare key, he'd once told me with a laugh, under the laughing Buddha by the azalea bush. It was a secret that made me feel trusted, an initiate into his world of casual rule-breaking. I found the key, a tarnished brass thing, right where he'd said it would be. The root beer was getting warm. The front door creaked open into the familiar, comforting chaos of his living room. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and, faintly, of coffee. The room was a museum of Ben's life. Shelves bowed under the weight of books on music theory and abstract art, vinyl records spilled from milk crates, and several guitars stood propped in stands like silent sentinels. Uncle Ben, I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet house. It's Liam. Brought you some root beer. No answer. Just the low, steady hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I placed the bag on the cluttered coffee table, its surface a mosaic of guitar picks, sketchpads, and loose sheets of music. I figured I'd just hang out for a bit, maybe strum one of his acoustics until he got back. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint, but utterly out of place. It wasn't music. It wasn't the house settling. It was a voice. A child's voice, high and clear, followed by a soft, gentle laugh that was unmistakably my uncle's. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. A TV, I thought, but the sound wasn't coming from the living room television, which was dark and silent. It was coming from down the hall, from the door to his study, a room he'd always been oddly protective of. That's just my boring office, kid, he'd told me once when I'd asked to see inside. Tax forms and broken hard drives. Nothing exciting, but the sound was coming from there. A child's voice. 1,000 terrible, ill-formed thoughts crashed through my mind, fueled by a lifetime of internet horror stories and true crime documentaries. The image of my kind, gentle uncle began to warp and crack. The narrative I'd constructed, the cool, misunderstood artist, was suddenly under assault by a much darker, more terrifying possibility. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and dread. I should have left. I should have turned around, walked out, and called my dad. But a morbid, terrifying curiosity rooted me to the spot. I had to know. I had to see. I moved down the hallway, my sneakers making no sound on the worn Persian runner. The door to the study was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two. A sliver of light cut across the dark hallway floor. I could hear the voice more clearly now. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was speaking. And then the princess, she didn't need the knight to save her, because she knew how to use a sword herself. And Uncle Ben's voice, warm and full of encouragement, "That's right, Chloe. She was the smartest one in the whole kingdom." Chloe. Who was Chloe? My breath caught in my throat. I leaned forward, slowly, carefully, and peered through the crack in the door. The scene that unfolded before my eyes was so far from my grim expectations that my brain struggled to process it for a moment. The study wasn't a dusty room of tax forms. It was bright, clean, and organized. One entire wall was a bookshelf, but instead of esoteric music texts, it was filled with children's books, board games, and colorful art supplies. In the center of the room, sitting at a small, child-sized table, was Uncle Ben. He was facing away from me, but I could see his posture, relaxed, engaged. And sitting across from him was a little girl with pale blonde hair tied in a messy ponytail. She had large, expressive eyes and was wearing a pink t-shirt with a cartoon unicorn on it. She was coloring furiously on a large piece of paper. But that wasn't all. There was a woman in the room, too, sitting in a comfortable armchair in the corner. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, with a tired but kind face. She was watching them with a soft smile, her hands folded in her lap. This wasn't a secret horror. This was a secret joy. Before I could process this, before I could back away, the floorboard under my foot creaked, a loud, groaning sound in the quiet room. 3 heads turned in my direction at once. The little girl, Chloe, looked startled. The woman in the chair looked surprised, but not alarmed. And Uncle Ben, his face went through a rapid, heartbreaking series of emotions. First, shock, then, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes widened, and for a split second, he looked like a man who'd been caught in a terrible, unforgivable act. That look was quickly replaced by a deep, profound shame, and finally, a weary, resigned sadness. "Liam," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement of a boundary crossed, a secret shattered. I'm sorry," I stammered, my face burning with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. The door was open. I heard, "I brought you root beer." The explanation sounded idiotic even to my own ears. The woman in the corner stood up. "It's okay, Ben," she said softly. She walked over to the little girl. "Come on, Chloe, sweetie. Let's go see if we can find those cookies we brought." As the woman led Chloe out of the room, the little girl looked back at me with curious eyes before disappearing down the hall toward the kitchen. The room was left in a heavy, suffocating silence. Ben hadn't moved. He just sat at the small table, his shoulders slumped, staring at the half-finished princess drawing. "Uncle Ben," I said, my voice small. What is this?" He finally looked up at me, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was physically difficult to look at. This wasn't the fun, guitar-playing uncle I knew. This was a man carrying a weight I couldn't even begin to imagine. "You weren't supposed to see this, Liam," he said, his voice thick. "No one was. See what? Who are they? Is she your daughter?" The question felt both ridiculous and terrifyingly plausible. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped his lips. No, she's not my daughter." He took a deep, shuddering breath, as if steeling himself for a great ordeal. "Her name is Chloe. That's her mom, Sarah. They come here twice a week." "Why?" I asked, stepping fully into the room now. The evidence was all around me, the child-sized furniture, the artwork taped to the walls, the palpable feeling of care and safety in the space. Ben looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the internal debate raging behind his eyes. The secret he'd kept for so long was fighting to stay hidden, but the dam had already broken. "Sit down, Liam," he said, gesturing to a normal-sized chair near the wall. His voice was tired, stripped of all its usual playful energy. "If you're going to be in this room, you need to understand what it is. And you can't tell anyone. Not your mom, not your dad, no one. Do you understand? The gravity in his tone was absolute. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. And so, in that sunlit room surrounded by the innocent artifacts of childhood, my Uncle Ben told me a story that rewrote the history of our entire family. It began 10 years earlier. Ben wasn't just a touring musician, he was a genuinely talented one. He'd been the guitarist and songwriter for a band that was on the cusp of breaking out. They had a record deal, a manager, and a growing fan base. During that time, he'd fallen in love. Her name was Maria. He described her with a tenderness that made my heart ache, a fiery, passionate artist with a laugh that could fill a room. They were young, in love, and the future was a blindingly bright horizon. Then, she got pregnant. We were scared, but we were happy, Ben said, his gaze fixed on a point in the distant past. We decided to get married. We told your grandparents. We started looking for a little apartment near the venue where we usually played. He paused, swallowing hard. The silence in the room was deafening. Maria was 7 months pregnant when it happened, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. She was killed instantly. The air left my lungs. Oh, my God, Uncle Ben. The baby, he said, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. The baby was a little girl. They managed to save her. She was tiny, so tiny, but she was a fighter. We named her Isabella. Bella. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I had a cousin I never knew existed. What happened to her? I asked, barely able to form the words. She lived for 3 days, Ben said, the words flat, devoid of all emotion, as if all the feeling had been scoured out of him by the telling. Her lungs weren't developed enough. There was nothing they could do. I held her while she left. The image was too devastating to fully comprehend. My uncle, the young rock star with the world at his feet, holding his dying daughter in his arms after losing the love of his life. The grief was a physical presence in the room, a cold, dense fog that had lingered for a decade. The band fell apart, he continued. I fell apart. I couldn't write music. I couldn't play. Every note, every chord, was tied to a memory of Maria, of the future we'd planned. Your mom and dad, they tried to help. They wanted me to move on, to get a real job. They thought my music was a dead end, a reminder of the pain. So I let them think that. It was easier than telling them the truth, that the music wasn't the problem, it was the silence that came after it. He explained that for years, he drifted. The freelance design work was just something to pay the bills. His real life, his purpose, began 5 years ago when he started volunteering at a local children's hospital. He'd play his guitar softly for the sick kids, finding a way back to music not as a career, but as a solace. That's where he met Sarah. She was a nurse, and she had a daughter, Chloe, who was a long-term patient. Chloe had a severe, chronic immune deficiency. She was a bright, beautiful child who spent more time in the sterile hospital environment than she did at home or at school. She was isolated, lonely. I saw her, sitting in her room, coloring by herself, Ben said, a faint smile finally touching his lips. And I saw what my Bella might have looked like. I started spending time with her. I'd read to her, draw with her, make up silly songs. She started to get better, not just physically, but her spirit, it just bloomed. When Chloe was finally well enough to be discharged, her recovery was fragile. She was too susceptible to germs to be in a regular school or a public daycare. Sarah, a single mother, was struggling. She couldn't afford a full-time nanny, and she was terrified of putting Chloe in a group setting. So, I offered, Ben said simply. I turned my study into this. I read every book I could find on her condition. I installed a special air filter. I make sure everything is sanitized. She and Sarah come here twice a week. It gives Sarah a break to run errands or just rest, and it gives Chloe a safe place to just be a kid. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. This room, Liam, this isn't a sad place. This is where I found a reason to live again. This is where I get to be a father, in a small, broken way. Chloe calls me Uncle Ben, too. She doesn't know about Bella. No one does. The pieces of the puzzle that was my uncle finally snapped into place, forming a picture so different from the one my family had painted. His failures, his lack of a real career, his reclusiveness, it wasn't because he was irresponsible or lost. It was because he had built a secret life of profound service and love around a crater of grief. He had taken the most devastating experience imaginable and had channeled it into being a sanctuary for a sick little girl and her overburdened mother. The man I had pitied, the man my father sometimes spoke of with gentle exasperation, was a hero. A quiet, anonymous, heartbreaking hero. Why? I began, my voice cracking. Why didn't you tell us? Mom would understand. She's your sister. Ben shook his head, a deep sadness in his eyes. Your mom, she's a fixer, Liam. She would have tried to take over. She would have told everyone, turned it into a whole thing. She would have wanted to meet Sarah and Chloe, bring them into the family. And that's not what this is. This is fragile. This is mine. It's the one part of my life that isn't touched by the pity or the expectations of our family. Telling everyone would have risked it. Sarah values her privacy, and Chloe's health is the most important thing. I couldn't risk that. I won't risk that. He looked at me, his expression deadly serious. Which is why you can never, ever tell anyone what you saw here today. Not your parents, not your friends. No one. This secret dies with you, Liam. Do you promise me? I looked around the room again. At the drawing of the sword-wielding princess. At the small, colorful chairs. At the face of my uncle, which now looked not weak, but stronger than any I had ever seen. He had carried this alone for so long. I promise, I said, and the words felt like a vow, a sacred oath. I promise, Uncle Ben. The sound of footsteps came from the hall, and Sarah and Chloe reappeared. Chloe was holding a chocolate chip cookie, a smudge of chocolate on her cheek. All done with our secret snack? Ben asked, his voice miraculously shifting back to its warm, playful tone. The mask was back on, but now I could see the real face underneath. Chloe nodded, holding up her cookie. I saved you half, Uncle Ben. He took it with a theatrical bow. For me, I am honored, Princess Chloe. I stood up, feeling like an intruder again, but a welcome one this time. I should go, I said. Ben walked me to the front door, leaving Sarah and Chloe in the study. On the porch, the humid summer air felt different. The world felt different. Liam, Ben said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Thank you. For understanding. Thank you for telling me, I replied. She's a great kid. A genuine, unburdened smile broke across his face. Yeah, she really is. I drove home in a daze. The familiar streets of my town looked alien. The narrative of my life had been irrevocably altered. I walked into my own quiet, predictable house and saw my family photos on the wall in a new light. There was a ghost in them now, the ghost of a woman named Maria and a little girl named Bella. And there was a living, breathing hero, my uncle, who was so much more than any of us had ever given him credit for. Dinner that night was a surreal experience. My dad was talking about the stresses of a new bridge project. My mom was grading papers. They were the same, but I was different. I had knowledge, and with it, a newfound sense of responsibility and a painful, swelling pride for my uncle. Have you heard from Ben lately? My mom asked casually, passing me the green beans. I tried calling him yesterday, but he didn't pick up. I hope he's not getting behind on his bills again. I looked at my mother's concerned face and felt the weight of my promise settle deep in my soul. I saw now that her concern, while genuine, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who her brother was. I'm sure he's fine, Mom, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. He's probably just busy with one of his projects. You know how he gets when he's focused. She smiled, satisfied. That's true. He always did get lost in his own world. If only you knew, I thought. If only you knew what a beautiful world it is. That was the day my childhood truly ended. It wasn't marked by a grand ceremony or a dramatic rebellion, but by the burden and the gift of a secret. I had walked in on my uncle expecting one story and had discovered another, a story of devastating loss, profound love, and quiet, unwavering strength. It changed everything I thought I knew about family, about success, and about the hidden battles people fight every single day. And it taught me that the strongest people aren't always the ones with the most visible victories, but sometimes the ones who, in the quietest corners of the world, find a way to turn their deepest pain into a shelter for someone else.